Hello and welcome to the Jexit podcast. I'm your host Riley, a former Jehovah's Witness who left the religion in 2019. It recently occurred to me that the listeners of this podcast may not actually be familiar with my YouTube channel, which I've been running since 2020. And the reason why that's relevant is because on that channel I have a 6-part series of videos which chronicle the steps in the process of me waking up to the truth about the truth and realizing that the Jehovah's Witness religion isn't true. So I thought it would be a good idea to tell that story again effectively for my new audience on this podcast. So welcome to the first episode in that 6-part series, which will chronicle how I woke up from my JW indoctrination. In each episode, I'll discuss a particular step or milestone in that journey. So here goes, part 1. So the first step in my journey to realizing the truth about the Jehovah's Witness religion actually took place before I left. It was approximately 2 years before I left, in fact. And the catalyst for this was problems that I was having in my marriage. Now, I got married in 1998 at the age of 21, and our marriage was a tumultuous one right from the very start. Lots of ups and downs, but mostly downs. And there were several times during the course of the marriage that things really came to a head. And round about 2017 was one of those times. Now, there are a lot of reasons why our marriage was such a difficult one. But if I had to put it down to just one root cause, I would say that we just weren't compatible. We were a bad fit right from the very start. The entirety of the marriage, from my side, felt like I was trying to push a square peg into a round hole. Another related issue that I believe we had is that neither of us were a good fit for our respective roles within a Jehovah's Witness marriage. I was a bad fit as a spiritual head, and she was a bad fit as a submissive, supportive wife. So that added another layer of complexity to our already existing issues. And it greatly exacerbated what was already a very bad situation. So it's round about 2017 and we're getting assistance from the elders to help us with our various issues. And the way in which they go about rendering that assistance causes me to start having doubts. First of all, the advice that they give us as a couple and the advice that they gave to me as an individual was absolutely appalling. They said some things that were just so ridiculous. I don't know how I refrained from bursting out laughing in their face. One example that really sticks out in my mind is an elder telling me that the idea of compatibility between marriage mates is a worldly idea and that it is not scriptural. As long as two people in a marriage apply Bible principles, any two people can get married and have a happy and successful marriage. One elder actually told me that, and I just think that that is a ridiculous notion on its face. Not only did it fly in the face of common sense, but it was completely contradictory to the lived experience that I was currently having. I knew, and it was apparent to me on a day-to-day basis, that compatibility is essential in a marriage. Even if he had been able to show me a scripture in the Bible that said word for word the exact same thing that he expressed, I would have called it nonsense, even if it was in the Bible. So after hearing all of this advice that was, at worst, absolutely ridiculous, and at best, impractical, I thought to myself, but these elders are fulfilling a role in Jehovah's arrangement, and Jehovah is supposed to be leading them. So why is this advice so bad? I said to myself, I know the elders are imperfect men and that they will make mistakes. That's a given, and it's only reasonable to admit and accept that. But when they're fulfilling their duties that Jehovah has supposedly given them, and he hasn't just given them this role and then washed his hands of them. He's supposed to be actively leading them by means of his Holy Spirit. If that genuinely is the case, how could they do such a bad job? Logically, it means that either Jehovah is doing a bad job of leading them, or he's not leading them at all. Another big thing that contributed to my doubts was I could clearly see that the elders were treating me and my wife of the time very differently. There was a marked difference in the way they dealt with me and the way they dealt with her. I know that what I'm about to say is going to be very difficult for many of my listeners to accept, because the JW organization is misogynistic and patriarchal without a doubt. But in my case, with the issues that were in my marriage, it was the complete opposite. My concerns that I raised with the elders and the issues or the problems that I had with my relationship were routinely dismissed. I was dismissed and ignored and marginalized over and over and over again. Whereas with my wife, they always listened to her. They always addressed her concerns, but they did nothing of the kind to me. And by dismissing me in the way that they did, I could see that the effect it was having on my wife was that she saw it as tacit approval for the behavior that she was exhibiting in the relationship, which was often cruel, unkind, and unscriptural. It got to the point where I could tell if she'd been having discussions with the elders without me, because her behavior would get worse. And I remember raising this point with a couple of the elders once. I actually used the example of the election. I think it was the 2016 election where Donald Trump was elected. I said to them, do you recall seeing in the news that the day after the election, when Donald Trump won, there was a huge spike in racially motivated crimes because the people perpetrating those crimes saw Donald Trump's election as a mandate to behave in that way because he exhibits himself racist behavior and attitudes. So they saw his election as tacit approval for the things they did. And then I said to them, you are having exactly the same effect on my marriage because you dismiss routinely my legitimate complaints about her behavior and do nothing about them. She sees that as a mandate to continue in the same course of action. Now, at this point, I had not yet read the Shepherd the Flock of God book, which is the Elder's Handbook. I was aware of its existence, but I hadn't read it. Due to these experiences I was having with the elders, I was convinced that there was something in that book that told elders that they should refrain from counseling sisters unless they had committed a quote-unquote serious or gross sin. Because no other explanation made sense to me as to why they were so unduly lenient with her. So because of all of these issues that I was experiencing, I started to see the elder arrangement as being inherently flawed, but most of all, unjust. And it was a huge blow to my faith. It shocked me to the very core of my spiritual identity, for want of a better expression. In fact, there were a couple of times where I seriously contemplated ceasing to attend meetings. Now, I'm a very deep thinker. I'm a very analytical person by nature. Sometimes maybe, well, actually a lot of times, more so than I should be, or more so than the situation warrants. But during this period of time, I could not stop thinking about the things that I had experienced with the elders and the implications of those things, how those things affected the way I viewed the religion I was in and the way that I viewed my faith. There are a couple of things in particular that I wrestled with incessantly over this period of time. And one of them is this. I know that the organization is full of imperfect people. That is a given, and it would be unreasonable to think or expect otherwise. But if Jehovah really is backing this organization and Jesus is the one leading it, and everything the organization does is as a result of spirit direction, why can't the organization be perfect? Not at an individual level of the people, but at a systemic level. All of its structures and institutions, why can't they be perfect structures and perfect institutions, but just filled with imperfect people? Now, I know what I said just now might seem like a bit of a contradiction, but the way I reasoned it out at the time was, well, the Bible is perfect, and that was written by imperfect people. So if Jehovah can inspire imperfect men to write a perfect Bible, why can't he also inspire imperfect people to build and maintain and run a perfect organization? But that isn't what I was seeing. I was seeing flaws, not just in the people, but in the very systems on which the organization relies. And that just didn't make sense to me. There was no way for me to resolve that conflict in my mind. Another issue that I wrestled with was, I guess I could phrase it as the problem of evil and injustice and how it relates to the organization. I know that's a little bit vague, so I'll try to explain it the best way that I can. So if you ask any Jehovah's Witness why there is evil and wickedness and injustice in the world, they will give you the same answer. It's because the world is ruled by Satan. Satan is wicked, Satan is evil, and Satan is unjust. So the world he rules is a reflection of those qualities. I was taught that explanation from infancy, and in my JW mind, it made perfect sense. But if you were to ask any JW why, not all the time, but on occasion, evilness, wickedness, and injustice occurs within Jehovah's organization, the answer they will give you is this. Well, that's down to the imperfect people. But now, all of the experiences that I was going through at the time made me call into question the sense of that explanation. I started to see it as being logically inconsistent, self-serving, and highly convenient. Because if the world is the way it is because it's a reflection of its ruler, why is it that when bad things happen in the organization, that isn't a reflection of its ruler? Why do you blame the superior person in charge when it's the world, but you blame the subordinate members when it's the organization? You can't have it both ways. And it just seemed to me that Jehovah and Jesus get all the credit when things go right, but none of the blame or accountability when things go wrong. And that just didn't make any sense to me. But despite all of these experiences I was having and all of these questions I was wrestling with and how the whole situation made me feel, I stayed in the organization for another 2 years. But let me tell you, those 2 years were basically a blur. I remember nothing of being at the meetings, participating, listening, what we studied. I was only there in body. My mind had completely checked out. I would rather have been anywhere else when it was time for the meeting than sitting down inside the Kingdom Hall. I wouldn't describe myself as being PMO, physically in, mentally out at that time, because even though my mind had checked out from what was going on, I was essentially still a believer. I had my doubts, but I pushed those doubts to the back of my mind because I would ask myself the question, despite everything that's going on, despite all the reservations I have, do I 100% believe that this is the organization that Jehovah is using as his mouthpiece on earth today? And as long as my answer to that question was always yes, I put all of my doubts and all of the negativity from the situation I was in, I put it all to the back of my mind, and I just continued serving Jehovah on autopilot. But my heart wasn't really in it. And like I said, that situation carried on for the next 2 years until I ultimately left in April of 2019. So that was part 1 of the series chronicling how I woke up from the Jehovah's Witness religion. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. If so, please give it a thumbs up and a comment if you're listening on YouTube, and please rate the podcast if you're listening on a podcasting platform. That really helps to get this podcast to as many listeners as possible. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to keep up with future episodes. That's it for now. Thanks again for listening. I hope you have a great week.